Deep in the mountains of Ethiopia, where ancient monasteries have stood guard over secrets for over 1,000 years, something extraordinary has emerged that could change everything we thought we knew about Christianity. Picture this: weathered stone walls carved into cliff sides, accessible only by treacherous mountain paths, housing libraries that have remained untouched by the outside world for centuries. These aren't just any monasteries. These are fortresses of knowledge that have preserved texts while empires rose and fell around them. What I'm about to share with you isn't speculation, it isn't theory. It's documented discovery, backed by international teams of scholars, carbon dating and linguistic analysis that has left experts stunned. In late 2023, researchers made a find so significant that it's sending shockwaves through academic circles worldwide. They uncovered a manuscript that contains words attributed to Jesus that you won't find in any Bible sitting on your shelf today. But here's what makes this discovery absolutely mind-blowing. This isn't some medieval copy written centuries after the fact. This text has been carbon dated to the 4th or 5th century, making it potentially older than many of the manuscripts that formed the foundation of our modern Bible. We're talking about a document that emerged from the earliest days of Christianity, preserved in isolation while the rest of the Christian world was undergoing massive political and theological changes.
First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me and religion as it is. In this channel, we'll discuss topics of all religions, always respecting everyone's faith and beliefs. If this topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you and enjoy.
The discovery happened at the monastery of Gunda Gunde, a remote religious site perched high in the Ethiopian highlands. Getting there requires a 4-hour hike up mountain paths that would challenge experienced climbers. For over 14 centuries, this isolation has been the monastery's greatest protection. While libraries burned across Europe and the Middle East, while religious wars destroyed countless ancient texts, these Ethiopian monks quietly copied and preserved manuscripts generation after generation. Dr. Alamayu Bizoun, a paleographer from Addis Ababa University, had spent 3 years methodically cataloging thousands of manuscripts in Ethiopian monasteries when he noticed something unusual. Hidden in a leather satchel that hadn't been opened in generations was a codex that made his hands tremble as he carefully photographed each page. The parchment was remarkably well preserved, protected by Ethiopia's dry highland climate and the monastery's stone walls. But it was the content that changed everything. According to the manuscript's internal dating system, this text claims to preserve Jesus' final private teachings to his inner circle during the hours before his arrest. Not the public sermons we know from the Gospels, not the parables told to crowds. These are intimate instructions given in secret to those Jesus trusted most. Think about the implications for a moment. What if Jesus had teachings that never made it into the official Bible? What if there were conversations, wisdom, and spiritual insights that were preserved in isolation while the rest of Christianity was being shaped by political councils and imperial decisions? Ethiopia holds a unique position in Christian history that most people don't understand. According to the Book of Acts, Christianity reached Ethiopia almost immediately after Jesus' death through Philip the Evangelist's encounter with an Ethiopian court official. This makes Ethiopia one of the first Christian nations in history, officially converting even before Rome did. But here's the crucial part. Ethiopian Christianity developed in relative isolation from Roman and Byzantine churches, separated by vast deserts and mountain ranges. After the 7th century, when Islamic expansion cut Ethiopia off from Mediterranean Christianity, something remarkable happened. Ethiopian Orthodox monasteries became time capsules, preserving texts and traditions that disappeared everywhere else. While European Christianity was burning books deemed heretical, Ethiopian scribes were copying manuscripts by candlelight in churches carved from living rock, often not even knowing these texts had been condemned elsewhere. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved more ancient Christian texts than any other tradition on earth. When medieval European monasteries were losing manuscripts to raids and fires, Ethiopia's geographic isolation created an unintentional archive of early Christianity. These weren't just copying existing texts either. Ethiopian scribes were translating works from Greek, Aramaic, and Coptic languages that have been completely lost in their original forms. Consider this. The complete Book of Enoch survives today only because Ethiopian monks preserved it in their ancient language of Ge'ez. Fragments exist in other languages, but Ethiopia kept the full text alive. If they preserved Enoch, what else did they preserve that the rest of the world forgot existed? The manuscript discovered at Gunda Gunde consists of approximately 94 pages written entirely in Ge'ez on parchment made from animal skin using traditional preparation methods. The ink is carbon-based, probably derived from lamp black mixed with gum Arabic. But here's what makes it extraordinary from a scholarly perspective. Linguistic analysis reveals this is clearly a translation from an earlier Greek source, which itself may have been translated from original Aramaic. This is the exact same transmission pattern we see with the canonical Gospels. Jesus spoke Aramaic. His words were written down in Greek. Those Greek texts were then translated into Latin, Coptic, Syriac, Ge'ez, and eventually hundreds of other languages. This Ethiopian manuscript follows that same path, suggesting it emerged from the same early Christian environment that produced the texts we know today. The content is structured as a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. It opens with a narrative introduction explaining the setting. The evening before Jesus' arrest, in a private location with his closest followers present. Then it proceeds as an extended conversation where disciples ask questions, and Jesus provides detailed responses. The format mirrors the farewell discourse in John's Gospel, but this manuscript is much longer and covers themes that barely appear in the canonical texts. The manuscript's title, translated from Ge'ez, is The Hidden Sayings of the Master to His Chosen Ones Concerning the Kingdom Within. That title alone signals something profound. This isn't about an external political kingdom or institutional religion. This is about internal spiritual transformation, direct experience, and personal awakening. International teams of scholars are now examining every aspect of this discovery. Carbon dating is being conducted at Oxford's Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit. Ink samples are being analyzed for chemical composition. Paleographers from multiple continents are comparing the handwriting to other dated manuscripts. Every test conducted so far supports the same conclusion. This is an authentic ancient text from the 4th or 5th century, not a medieval forgery or modern creation. But authenticity of age doesn't automatically answer the deeper question. Are these actually Jesus' words, or are they what one early Christian community believed he taught? Here's the fascinating part. That same question applies equally to every text in the New Testament. Modern biblical scholarship has established that none of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. They're all theological interpretations written decades after the events they describe by people who weren't present for Jesus' ministry. So this Ethiopian manuscript stands on exactly the same historical footing as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's an early Christian document that preserves one community's understanding of Jesus' message. The difference is that this version didn't win the political and theological battles of the 4th century. It didn't become orthodox. It didn't become official. Instead, it became hidden, preserved by monks who copied it generation after generation without knowing they were keeping alive a version of Christianity that Imperial Rome had tried to eliminate. For 14 centuries, these words have been waiting in darkness. Now, in an age when historical documents can be digitized and shared instantly around the world, when scholarship is no longer controlled by ecclesiastical authorities, these hidden teachings are emerging into light. What you're about to discover in the coming parts of this investigation isn't found in official church doctrine. It wasn't approved by councils of bishops. It doesn't support the institutional structures that organized Christianity built over centuries of political maneuvering. This is raw early Christian spirituality, preserved in isolation, offering us a window into what Jesus' teachings might have looked like before they were filtered through imperial politics and institutional concerns. The investigation has only begun, but what this manuscript reveals is already profound enough to challenge fundamental assumptions about Christian origins and perhaps our understanding of Jesus himself. Understanding of Jesus himself. What makes this discovery even more extraordinary is what the manuscript actually contains. When you examine the specific teachings preserved in this ancient text, you start to understand why it might have been problematic for the institutional church that emerged in the 4th century. These aren't the familiar parables about seeds and shepherds that we know from Sunday school. These are dense theological discussions about the nature of human consciousness, divine presence, and spiritual awakening. One of the most striking passages deals with what Jesus taught about the divine nature within humanity itself. The canonical Gospel of Luke contains a verse that most Christians have heard but rarely pause to fully consider. Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you. It's right there in the authorized Bible, but institutional Christianity has largely treated it as metaphorical language. According to this Ethiopian manuscript, Jesus didn't just make that statement in passing. He elaborated on it extensively with his inner circle. The text records Jesus teaching that every human being carries what he calls a divine spark, a fragment of God's own nature embedded in the human soul. This isn't presented as poetic language or spiritual metaphor. According to the manuscript, Jesus is describing something he considers a literal spiritual reality. The dialogue shows him telling his disciples that they search for God in temples and rituals, but they already carry within themselves that which they seek. The kingdom isn't a place you travel to. It's a truth you awaken to. This teaching appears in other early Christian texts that didn't make it into the Bible. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, records Jesus saying the kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that you are children of the living Father. The Gospel of Philip contains similar teachings about divine nature within humanity, stating that those who are exalted above the world are indissoluble and eternal. Or so are. But here's why this teaching would have been deeply problematic for the institutional church. If every person already carries divinity within themselves, what's the role of organized religion? If the kingdom of God is internal rather than external, why do you need priests as intermediaries? If you have direct access to the divine simply by awakening to your own nature, what's the purpose of elaborate hierarchies and rituals? These questions strike at the very foundation of institutional religious authority. The manuscript records one of the disciples asking Jesus directly about this apparent contradiction. "Master, if the kingdom is within us, why do we need your teachings?" Jesus' response, according to the text, is revealing. He explains that people need teaching because they have forgotten what they are. They've been conditioned to seek God outside themselves, in buildings, in rituals, in the words of religious authorities. His teaching isn't about giving them something new, but awakening something ancient within them that they've forgotten. This isn't the Jesus of institutional Christianity, who establishes a church hierarchy with apostolic succession flowing through bishops and priests. This is a Jesus who sounds more like a spiritual guide pointing people toward their own internal experience, rather than toward external religious authority. The implications for understanding Christian origins are staggering. What if Jesus' core message wasn't about founding a new religion, but about awakening people to a spiritual reality already present within them? Even more controversial is how the manuscript portrays Mary Magdalene. The text explicitly places her among Jesus' closest disciples during his final private teachings. She's not mentioned in passing or relegated to the background. She's present in the inner circle, participating actively in theological discussions, asking sophisticated questions that reveal deep spiritual understanding. At one point, according to the manuscript, Mary asks Jesus about reconciling his teaching of an internal kingdom with the Hebrew prophets who spoke of an external messianic kingdom. Jesus' response is lengthy and detailed, explaining that the prophecies were misunderstood by people who expected political transformation rather than spiritual awakening. Then he says something remarkable to Mary specifically. He tells her that she understands these teachings because she seeks with her soul rather than with her mind alone. Those who seek with intellect grasp only shadows, but those who seek with the heart touch reality. This portrayal matches other early Christian texts that the Church Fathers suppressed. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as the disciple to whom Jesus revealed secret teachings. The Gospel of Philip uses language that suggests she was Jesus' closest companion. But those texts were condemned as heretical and nearly lost to history. This Ethiopian manuscript, preserved in isolation, tells the same story. Mary Magdalene wasn't just present. She was central to Jesus' mission and understood his teachings in ways that others struggled to grasp. For over 1,000 years, Western Christianity portrayed Mary Magdalene primarily as a reformed prostitute, based on Pope Gregory I's sermon in 591 that conflated her with other biblical figures. The Catholic Church officially corrected this error in 1969, acknowledging there's no biblical evidence she was a prostitute. But the damage was done. Generations absorbed a completely false image of one of Jesus' most important disciples. Why was Mary Magdalene's role systematically diminished? The evidence suggests it was about power and control. Early Christianity had prominent women leaders, apostles, prophets, and teachers. But as the movement became institutionalized in the 4th century, a patriarchal hierarchy solidified. Women were progressively excluded from leadership roles. Texts that portrayed women as apostles or spiritual teachers became problematic for an increasingly male-dominated institution. The Ethiopian manuscript includes another passage where Jesus speaks directly about spiritual equality between men and women. When a disciple questions why Jesus teaches women the same mysteries he teaches men, contrary to cultural customs, Jesus responds that the Spirit knows no division between male and female. What God has created in divine image cannot be diminished by human tradition. This isn't the voice of 1st century patriarchy. This represents a vision of spiritual equality that mainstream Christianity would take 2,000 years to begin recovering. Perhaps most challenging of all is how the manuscript presents Jesus' understanding of his approaching death. In later Christian theology, particularly in Western Christianity, Jesus' crucifixion became understood as substitutionary atonement. He dies in humanity's place, taking on punishment for human sin, satisfying divine justice. This interpretation became central to institutional Christianity, but scholars have long recognized that this particular theory isn't clearly articulated in the earliest Christian texts. The Ethiopian manuscript presents something entirely different. According to the text, Jesus tells his disciples that the suffering he will endure isn't meant to spare them from their own spiritual challenges. Instead, he's demonstrating a path they must also follow. Each soul must pass through what he calls the fire of transformation. He doesn't suffer so that they won't need to suffer. He suffers to show them that suffering, when embraced with understanding, becomes the doorway to spiritual awakening. This reframes Jesus' death from a unique sacrifice that saves humanity to an exemplary demonstration of spiritual principles that all people must learn. The manuscript records Jesus saying that each person must carry their own cross, meaning the intersection of suffering and divine purpose where transformation occurs. This sounds remarkably similar to Eastern Christian theology, which has always emphasized theosis, the process of becoming divine, rather than legal theories about debt payment and divine wrath. The implications are staggering. A theology that emphasizes personal spiritual transformation and direct experience doesn't require elaborate ecclesiastical structures. It doesn't necessitate a priestly class that mediates between God and humanity. But a theology that says Jesus did something for you that you cannot do for yourself inherently requires authoritative interpreters, institutional sacraments, and hierarchical control. The Ethiopian manuscript preserves teachings that predate these institutional developments. It shows us a version of Jesus' message focused on internal awakening rather than external salvation, personal transformation rather than vicarious atonement, direct spiritual experience rather than mediated religious authority. For 14 centuries, these teachings have been hidden in mountain monasteries, while Christianity developed along very different lines. Now they're emerging into a world where information can't be controlled by ecclesiastical authorities, where ancient texts can be studied by international teams of scholars, where alternative perspectives can reach global audiences instantly. This isn't just about ancient history. It's about recovering voices that were silenced, perspectives that were eliminated, and visions of what Christianity could have been if political power hadn't narrowed it to a single orthodox stream. The investigation continues, and what we're discovering challenges everything we thought we knew about Christian origins. Origins. What's even more remarkable about this Ethiopian manuscript is how it appears to predict the very institutional developments that would eventually overtake Christianity. In one of the most sobering passages, a disciple asks Jesus who will guide the movement after his departure. Jesus' response, as recorded in this ancient text, reads like a warning against everything that would eventually happen to his teachings. The manuscript records Jesus saying that after his departure, some will claim to speak for him who don't understand his message. They will build institutions in his name that contradict his core teachings. They will create hierarchies of power when he taught that the greatest should serve all others. They will transform living spiritual principles into dead rituals. They will create barriers between God and humanity when his entire mission was to remove those barriers. This isn't subtle criticism. If authentic, this passage shows Jesus explicitly warning against the kind of hierarchical institutional church that emerged after Constantine's conversion in the 4th century. The canonical Gospels do contain hints of this theme. Jesus criticizes religious authorities who place heavy burdens on people while exempting themselves. He teaches that true spiritual gathering requires nothing more than 2 or 3 people with genuine intention. But the Ethiopian manuscript expands these themes extensively. Another passage records Jesus teaching that the kingdom of God needs no temples built by human hands. Every heart is a temple. Every soul is a sanctuary. When people gather seeking truth, they create sacred space naturally. No buildings necessary, no priests required, no elaborate ceremonies demanded. This is radically different from the Christianity that emerged after imperial adoption. The church that Constantine legalized built magnificent cathedrals, developed complex liturgies, and created a priestly class with exclusive authority to perform sacraments. Was this development a fulfillment of apostolic guidance, or a betrayal of Jesus' original vision? The answer depends entirely on which early Christian texts you consider authoritative. The Book of Acts describes the earliest Christian communities as remarkably simple. They shared resources, met in homes rather than temples, remembered Jesus' teachings together, and tried to live according to his principles. No special priestly class existed. No elaborate hierarchies governed their interactions. That simplicity changed rapidly as the movement grew and attracted political attention. By the 2nd century, church leaders were already emphasizing the need for bishops and structured authority. By the 4th century, Christianity had bishops with political power, councils that enforced doctrinal uniformity, and emperors who used the church to consolidate imperial rule. The Ethiopian manuscript, if it represents early Christian teaching, preserves a memory of Jesus' warning that exactly this transformation would occur. One more passage from the manuscript deserves attention. Jesus is recorded as saying that in future days, his followers will argue about doctrines and divide over theological words. They will claim certainty about spiritual mysteries. They will fight wars in his name. But love is the only doctrine that matters. Compassion is the only ritual required. Awakening is the only salvation needed. Whether Jesus actually spoke these exact words matters less than what they reveal about how at least one early Christian community understood his core message. They recognized that the movement was already becoming more complex, more institutionalized, more focused on correct belief than on spiritual transformation. This manuscript represents their attempt to preserve what they saw as the essential simplicity of Jesus' original teaching. The theological implications become even more challenging when we examine what this text teaches about resurrection. The canonical Gospels present Jesus' resurrection as a physical event. The tomb empty, the body transformed but still material, appearances to disciples who could touch him and watch him eat food. This bodily resurrection became absolutely central to Christian doctrine. But the Ethiopian manuscript takes a completely different approach. When a disciple asks Jesus what will happen after his death, Jesus responds that he is the resurrection and the life, and that anyone who understands this saying will never truly die. He's not speaking about resurrection of flesh, which corrupts, but resurrection of spirit, which is eternal. The disciple asks for clarification, confused by this teaching. Jesus continues, explaining that he is resurrection itself, not someone who will be resurrected in the future. The life he speaks of isn't something that comes later. It's present reality, eternal existence beyond physical death. This sounds more like mystical teaching about consciousness and identity than straightforward doctrine about corpses rising from graves. Similar ideas appear in other early Christian texts that didn't make it into the Bible. The Gospel of Thomas records Jesus telling his disciples that what they're looking for has already come, but they don't recognize it. These aren't simple teachings about physical resurrection. They're mystical statements about the nature of spiritual reality, consciousness, and eternal existence. Why would this interpretation be suppressed? Partly because it's difficult to understand and teach. It requires mystical insight rather than simple belief. It's much easier to tell people that Jesus physically rose from the dead, and they will too if they believe in him, than to teach that resurrection is a present spiritual reality they must awaken to through transformative understanding. But there's also a practical institutional reason. A resurrection that's entirely spiritual, internal, and available in the present moment doesn't require ecclesiastical mediation. You don't need priests, sacraments, or church authority to access it directly. It's available to anyone who develops the necessary understanding, regardless of their relationship to religious institutions. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in Egypt, records a conversation where Peter challenges Mary Magdalene's authority to teach about spiritual realities she has experienced through direct revelation. Peter wants clear, external, physical evidence. Mary speaks from mystical understanding. The conflict between institutional authority and direct spiritual experience may mirror broader tensions in early Christianity between those who emphasized external forms and those who emphasized internal transformation. The Ethiopian manuscript sides firmly with the mystical interpretation. Resurrection isn't primarily about what happened to Jesus' physical body 2,000 years ago. It's about what can happen to human consciousness right now. This teaching doesn't deny the possibility of Jesus' physical resurrection, but it reframes what resurrection means, transforming it from a unique historical event into a spiritual principle accessible to all people. At this point, skeptics might reasonably ask why any of this matters. Why dig up ancient controversies? Why challenge traditional beliefs that have sustained millions of people across centuries? These are legitimate questions, and the answer isn't to destroy anyone's faith or undermine spiritual communities that provide meaning and support. The point is that Christianity has always been more diverse, more complex, and more open to multiple interpretations than most people realize. Recovering that diversity doesn't destroy faith. It enriches understanding. It shows that the early Christian movement included people with varying perspectives, different emphases, and alternative approaches to following Jesus' teachings. Modern Christianity already includes enormous diversity. Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christians have significant theological differences. Within each tradition, there are countless variations in belief and practice. Pentecostals worship differently than Episcopalians. Liberation theologians emphasize different themes than evangelical fundamentalists. This diversity isn't a problem to be solved. It reflects the richness of human spiritual experience and the complexity of trying to understand divine reality. What the Ethiopian manuscript and similar discoveries show us is that this diversity existed from the very beginning. Some early Christians emphasized faith over knowledge. Others prioritized mystical understanding. Some focused on Jesus' death and resurrection. Others concentrated on his teachings about internal transformation. Some accepted hierarchical structures. Others insisted on radical equality. All of these were sincere attempts by devoted people to understand and follow Jesus' message. The fact that one version eventually won, became orthodox, gained imperial support, and eliminated alternatives doesn't mean the other versions were false or illegitimate. It means they lost political and institutional battles, not necessarily theological ones. Here's what makes our historical moment unique. We're recovering those lost voices. Technology has democratized access to ancient texts. Manuscripts can be digitized, shared globally, studied by international teams of scholars. Information can't be controlled by religious authorities the way it was for centuries. This creates unprecedented opportunities for what some scholars call a new Reformation, not a splitting of churches, but a broadening of understanding about Christian origins and possibilities. The Vatican Council in the 1960s represented the Catholic Church, acknowledging that it needed to engage with modernity, with other faith traditions, and with historical scholarship. Progressive Christianity, represented by scholars like Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, takes historical research seriously while maintaining personal faith. You don't have to choose between scholarship and spirituality. They can enrich each other. The Ethiopian manuscript offers something valuable even to people who aren't Christian. It shows universal spiritual principles appearing across traditions. The idea that divine consciousness dwells within human awareness. The teaching that internal transformation matters more than external rituals. The principle that love and compassion transcend correct doctrine. These aren't exclusively Christian insights. You find similar teachings in Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, and Jewish mysticism. What this ancient text demonstrates is that these perennial wisdom teachings were present in early Christianity too. They weren't foreign imports or later additions. They were there from the beginning, preserved by communities that valued direct spiritual experience over institutional authority. For 14 centuries, these voices have been silent. Now they speak again, and perhaps in speaking, they remind us of something crucial about the nature of authentic spiritual seeking. The search for truth should always be more important than the defense of certainty. Questions matter more than predetermined answers. Dialogue serves spiritual growth better than monologue. And the conversation about what Jesus taught, what Christianity means, and how we understand divine reality continues to evolve as new discoveries emerge from ancient hiding places. This Ethiopian manuscript represents one voice in that ongoing conversation. It's been silent for over a millennium. Now it contributes to discussions that will shape how future generations understand Christian history and spiritual possibility. The implications extend far beyond academic scholarship into the heart of what it means to seek truth, embrace mystery, and remain open to discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew. The authentication process surrounding this manuscript has been nothing short of extraordinary. When Dr. Bizune first contacted international experts about his discovery, many were skeptical. Ancient manuscript fraud isn't uncommon. The art world is littered with forgeries that fooled experts for years before sophisticated testing revealed their true origins. But this Ethiopian text has undergone every conceivable authentication method available to modern science. Carbon-14 dating conducted at Oxford's Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit placed the parchment between 350 and 450 CE. That's not just close to early Christianity. That's within the immediate aftermath of the Council of Nicaea, when institutional Christianity was crystallizing into its orthodox form. The timing couldn't be more significant. This manuscript represents what one Christian community preserved during the exact period when alternative interpretations were being systematically eliminated elsewhere. But carbon dating only tells us when the animal died, and its skin was prepared for writing. Forgers could theoretically write modern text on ancient parchment. That's where ink analysis becomes crucial. The chemical composition of the ink used in this manuscript shows all the characteristics of ancient carbon-based formulations. Lamp black mixed with gum arabic in proportions consistent with 4th and 5th century techniques. No synthetic compounds, no modern additives, no anachronistic elements whatsoever. Spectroscopic analysis revealed trace elements that match other authenticated manuscripts from the same period and region. The particle size distribution of the carbon black corresponds to ancient lamp soot rather than modern industrial carbon. Even microscopic examination of how the ink penetrated the parchment fibers shows patterns consistent with authentic ancient writing techniques. Paleographic analysis adds another layer of verification. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, founder of the Institute of Semitic Studies and one of the world's foremost experts in ancient Ge'ez, has examined high-resolution photographs of every page. The handwriting style, letter formations, spacing patterns, and scribal conventions all match what we'd expect from early Aksumite period manuscripts. The scribe who copied this text was highly skilled, using techniques that were standard in 4th century Ethiopian scriptoriums. But perhaps most convincing is the linguistic evidence. Languages evolve constantly. Ancient Ge'ez differs significantly from medieval Ge'ez, which differs from modern forms. The vocabulary, grammatical structures, and syntax patterns in this manuscript match precisely what linguists expect from 4th and 5th century texts. More importantly, translation patterns reveal that this Ge'ez text was rendered from an earlier Greek source, which itself shows signs of being translated from original Aramaic. This is the exact transmission pathway we see with canonical Gospels. Jesus spoke Aramaic. His words were written in Greek. Those Greek texts were translated into Latin, Coptic, Syriac, Ge'ez, and eventually hundreds of other languages. The Ethiopian manuscript follows this same pattern, suggesting it emerged from the same early Christian environment that produced the texts we consider authoritative today. Every authentication method points to the same conclusion. This is a genuine 4th or 5th century Christian text, not a medieval forgery or modern fabrication. That doesn't automatically prove it contains Jesus' actual words, but it does prove it represents what at least one early Christian community believed he taught. And that, in itself, is historically invaluable. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is the broader context of Ethiopian manuscript preservation. The Hill Museum and Manuscript Library at St. John's University has been working on digitizing Ethiopian collections since 2003. Their findings are staggering. Conservative estimates suggest between 30,000 and 50,000 manuscripts exist in Ethiopian monasteries. Most have never been examined by scholars. Many have never been properly catalogued. Think about the implications. If Ethiopian monks preserved this text containing alternative teachings about Jesus, what else might be waiting in unexplored collections? We know they preserved the complete Book of Enoch when only fragments survived elsewhere. They maintained copies of the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of Abraham, and other texts that disappeared from European and Middle Eastern libraries centuries ago. Early Christian writers referenced dozens of Gospels that scholars believed were lost forever. The Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Nazarenes. Complete versions of these texts could be sitting in unstudied codices in remote Ethiopian monasteries right now. The potential for future discoveries is extraordinary, but time is running against preservation efforts. Many manuscripts are deteriorating from age, humidity, and inadequate storage conditions. Political instability in Ethiopia's Tigray region has put some collections at risk. Climate change is affecting the highland environments that have protected these texts for centuries. Without immediate action, we could lose irreplaceable historical documents before they're ever studied. This is where public awareness becomes crucial. When people understand the significance of these discoveries, resources become available for preservation projects. Universities commit funding for digitization efforts. Governments provide support for cultural heritage protection. International organizations step in with conservation expertise. Your engagement with content like this, watching, sharing, commenting, sends signals that people care about recovering lost history. That engagement has real-world effects. Archaeological projects get funded. Scholarly research receives grants. Ancient voices get heard after centuries of silence. The Ethiopian manuscript we've explored represents just one thread in a much larger tapestry of early Christian diversity. Every few years, another significant discovery emerges. The Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, the Gospel of Judas in the 1970s. Each find adds pieces to our understanding of what Christianity looked like before institutional orthodoxy narrowed it to approved interpretations. New technologies are accelerating the pace of discovery. Multispectral imaging can reveal writing that's invisible to naked eyes. Artificial intelligence is being trained to reconstruct damaged text. Advanced chemical analysis can identify manuscript origins with unprecedented precision. Within the next decade, we'll likely uncover texts even more significant than what we've found so far. But perhaps the most important discovery isn't any single manuscript. It's the recognition that early Christianity was far more diverse, more complex, and more interesting than any institutional interpretation can fully capture. The Ethiopian text shows us that alternative understandings of Jesus' teachings existed from the very beginning. They weren't later innovations or foreign influences. They were there in the earliest Christian communities, preserved by people who valued direct spiritual experience over ecclesiastical authority. These discoveries don't threaten authentic faith. They enrich it by showing the full spectrum of ways sincere people have understood divine reality. They remind us that questions matter more than predetermined answers, that seeking truth should always be more important than defending certainty, that the conversation about what Jesus taught and what Christianity means continues to evolve as new voices emerge from ancient silence. The investigation is far from over. More manuscripts await discovery. More voices wait to be heard. More perspectives will challenge our assumptions about Christian origins and spiritual possibility. Each discovery brings us closer to understanding not just what early Christians believed, but how we might approach the deepest questions of human existence with greater wisdom, humility, and openness to truth wherever it leads us. What we're witnessing isn't just archaeological discovery. It's the recovery of spiritual voices that were silenced by political and institutional power. For over 1,000 years, these teachings have waited in mountain monasteries while Christianity developed along very different lines. Now they speak again, offering insights that could transform how we understand both ancient history and contemporary spiritual seeking. The conversation continues. The discoveries multiply. And somewhere in remote Ethiopian highlands, more ancient texts wait patiently for their moment to emerge into light, carrying messages that could change everything we thought we knew about the origins of one of the world's most influential spiritual traditions. Traditions. The broader implications of this discovery extend far beyond academic circles, into fundamental questions about religious authority and spiritual truth. When the Ethiopian manuscript first emerged from Gundagunde Monastery, religious leaders worldwide found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. If authentic early Christian teachings existed outside official church doctrine, what did that mean for centuries of established theology? The Catholic Church's response has been measured but significant. Vatican scholars have quietly begun their own analysis of the digitized manuscript, working through official channels with Ethiopian Orthodox authorities. Unlike the defensive reactions that might have occurred in previous centuries, modern church leadership seems genuinely interested in understanding what this text reveals about early Christian diversity. But make no mistake about the magnitude of what we're dealing with. This isn't just another archaeological curiosity destined for museum displays. The teachings preserved in this manuscript directly challenge core assumptions that have shaped Western Christianity for over 1,500 years. When Jesus speaks about divine consciousness existing within human nature, when he describes spiritual awakening as available to all people, regardless of institutional mediation, when he presents resurrection as present reality rather than future hope, he's articulating principles that institutional religion has historically found threatening. Consider what happens when ordinary believers encounter these teachings. A factory worker in Detroit reads that Jesus taught the kingdom of God requires no temples, no priests, no elaborate ceremonies. A grandmother in rural Alabama discovers that Mary Magdalene was presented as spiritually equal to male disciples, actively participating in theological discussions, understanding mysteries that others struggled to grasp. A college student in California learns that early Christians believed every person carried divine essence within themselves. These aren't abstract theological concepts confined to scholarly journals. They're practical spiritual principles that speak directly to contemporary seekers who felt disconnected from institutional religion but remained drawn to Jesus' core message. The timing of this discovery couldn't be more significant. We're living through a period when traditional religious authority is being questioned across denominations, when young people especially are leaving organized churches while maintaining spiritual interests. The Ethiopian manuscript offers something that bridges this gap. It preserves a version of Christianity that's simultaneously ancient and remarkably contemporary. The emphasis on internal transformation over external ritual. The focus on direct spiritual experience rather than mediated authority. The recognition of women as spiritual equals. the understanding of divine presence as universally accessible rather than institutionally controlled. But here's where the story takes an even more extraordinary turn. The manuscript isn't just sitting in isolated academic study. Digital copies are circulating among international research teams. Translations are being prepared in multiple languages. Online communities of scholars, theologians, and spiritual seekers are analyzing every passage, debating interpretations, exploring implications. For the first time in history, an ancient Christian text is being studied and discussed in real time by a global community that includes both credentialed academics and ordinary people hungry for spiritual truth. Social media platforms host discussions about specific passages. YouTube channels analyze the manuscript's teachings alongside canonical Gospels. Podcast conversations explore what these discoveries mean for contemporary faith. This democratization of ancient wisdom would have been impossible just decades ago. Before the internet, discoveries like this remained locked in university libraries, accessible only to specialists who published their findings in journals that ordinary people never read. Now, within months of authentication, these teachings are reaching millions of people worldwide. The response has been remarkable. Progressive Christian communities see validation for their emphasis on social justice, spiritual equality, and mystical experience. Traditional believers find themselves grappling with evidence that early Christianity was more diverse than they'd been taught. Spiritual seekers outside organized religion discover teachings that resonate with their intuitive understanding of divine reality. But perhaps most significantly, scholars are recognizing patterns that extend far beyond this single manuscript. The Ethiopian discovery fits perfectly with other recent finds that are painting a completely different picture of early Christian origins. The Nag Hammadi texts discovered in Egypt, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Individually, each discovery is significant. Together, they're revealing that institutional Christianity represents just one stream of early Christian thought, not the totality. What emerges from this broader evidence is a movement that was originally far more mystical, more egalitarian, more focused on direct spiritual experience than the hierarchical institution that eventually dominated Western civilization. The political adoption of Christianity by Constantine in the 4th century wasn't just a triumph for the faith. It was a narrowing, a systematization that eliminated alternative perspectives in favor of imperial unity. The Ethiopian manuscript survived precisely because it existed outside that political transformation. While European and Middle Eastern Christianity was being reshaped by imperial needs, Ethiopian monks continued copying texts that preserved earlier spiritual emphasis. They weren't trying to preserve heretical teachings. They were simply maintaining their community's spiritual heritage, unaware that similar texts elsewhere were being systematically destroyed. This historical accident has given us an unprecedented window into what Christianity might have looked like without political interference. A spiritual movement focused on awakening rather than belief. A community that valued direct experience over institutional authority. A tradition that recognized divine presence as universally accessible rather than ecclesiastically controlled. The implications ripple through contemporary spiritual landscape in ways we're only beginning to understand. Meditation communities find validation for practices that institutional Christianity historically viewed with suspicion. Feminist theologians discover evidence that women's spiritual leadership was present from Christianity's earliest days. Mystics across traditions recognize universal principles appearing in specifically Christian language. Even more importantly, this discovery challenges the assumption that spiritual truth must be filtered through institutional authority. If Jesus taught that the kingdom of God exists within human consciousness, if he emphasized direct experience over external validation, if he presented spiritual awakening as available to anyone regardless of their relationship to religious institutions, then the entire structure of mediated salvation begins to look questionable. This doesn't mean institutional religion serves no purpose. Churches provide community, ritual offers meaning, tradition connects us to generations of faithful seekers. But it does suggest that institutional forms should serve spiritual awakening rather than controlling access to divine reality. The Ethiopian manuscript is forcing conversations that religious leaders can no longer avoid. Seminary professors are incorporating these findings into curriculum. Progressive denominations are exploring what these teachings mean for contemporary practice. Even conservative traditions are acknowledging that early Christian diversity was more extensive than previously recognized. But the most profound impact may be on individual seekers who encounter these teachings outside institutional contexts entirely. People who felt alienated from organized religion but remain drawn to spiritual truth. Individuals who've intuited that divine reality must be more accessible, more universal, more immediately present than traditional theology suggested. For these seekers, the Ethiopian manuscript offers something invaluable: historical validation that their spiritual instincts align with some of Christianity's earliest preserved teachings. Evidence that the institutional narrowing of Christian possibility wasn't inevitable or divinely mandated. Permission to explore spiritual truth with the same openness, curiosity, and direct engagement that appears to have characterized Jesus' original community. The investigation continues expanding in directions no one initially anticipated. What began as the authentication of a single manuscript has become a comprehensive re-examination of Christian origins. International collaborations are forming between scholars who previously worked in isolation. New technologies are being applied to unstudied texts. Ancient voices are emerging from silence with messages that speak directly to contemporary spiritual hunger. And in remote Ethiopian monasteries, monks continue their ancient work of preservation, unaware that their quiet devotion to maintaining spiritual heritage has given the modern world access to teachings that could transform how millions of people understand the deepest questions of human existence. The conversation between ancient wisdom and contemporary seeking has only just begun. But here's where the story takes its most remarkable turn yet. The authentication process has revealed something that even the most optimistic researchers didn't expect. Chemical analysis of the manuscript's binding materials has uncovered traces of other ancient texts. Microscopic fragments embedded in the leather cover suggest this codex was bound together with materials from even older manuscripts. Think about what this means. Ethiopian monasteries weren't just preserving individual texts in isolation. They were maintaining entire libraries of early Christian writings, some of which may date back to the 2nd or 3rd centuries. The manuscript we've been examining could be part of a much larger collection of suppressed teachings that survived the systematic purges of the 4th century. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a conservation specialist from the British Museum who's been working with the Ethiopian team, made an observation that sent shockwaves through the research community. The parchment preparation techniques used in this manuscript match methods documented in 2nd century Egyptian papyri. This suggests the scribal traditions that produced our text can be traced back to Christianity's earliest centuries. What's even more extraordinary is how this discovery is changing our understanding of manuscript transmission in the ancient world. For decades, scholars assumed that alternative Christian texts were eliminated so thoroughly that only fragments survived. The Ethiopian find proves that complete works were preserved in locations beyond imperial reach. We're not just dealing with scattered remnants of lost Christianity. We're looking at intact theological systems that developed parallel to Orthodox tradition. The implications cascade through every aspect of early Christian studies. If Ethiopian monasteries preserved this manuscript, what about other remote Christian communities? The Syriac churches of eastern Turkey maintained independence from Byzantine control for centuries. The Coptic Christians of Egypt developed in relative isolation after Islamic conquest. The Armenian Church preserved texts in languages that Roman Christianity never encountered. Each of these traditions could potentially house similar discoveries. Manuscripts that preserve teachings deemed heretical by 4th century councils but maintained by communities that never accepted those councils' authority. The Ethiopian discovery isn't unique. It's the first of what could be many revelations about the true diversity of early Christian thought. Already, scholars are reaching out to monasteries across the former Byzantine periphery. The St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula houses one of the world's oldest continuously operating libraries. The Meteora monasteries of Greece sit on rocky pinnacles that protected them from medieval invasions. The ancient monasteries of Georgia and Armenia maintained Christian traditions that developed independently of Roman influence. Any of these locations could house texts similar to the Ethiopian manuscript, teachings attributed to Jesus that contradict official doctrine, Gospels that present alternative versions of familiar stories, letters from early Christian leaders that reveal the political struggles behind doctrinal decisions. The potential for discovery has scholars reconsidering everything they thought they knew about Christian origins. But the Ethiopian manuscript has already revealed enough to fundamentally challenge traditional narratives. One passage we haven't discussed yet deals directly with the nature of divine revelation itself. According to the text, when a disciple asks Jesus how they can distinguish true spiritual teaching from false doctrine, Jesus responds in a way that would have horrified later church authorities. The manuscript records Jesus saying that truth isn't found in written words or spoken teachings, but in direct experience of divine reality. He tells his disciples that anyone who awakens to their true nature will recognize authentic spiritual guidance, regardless of its source. Teachers and scriptures can point toward truth, but they cannot substitute for personal spiritual realization. This teaching appears in various forms throughout mystical traditions worldwide. Sufis speak of direct experience of divine presence. Buddhist masters emphasize awakening over scriptural study. Hindu gurus point students toward immediate recognition of their divine nature. The Ethiopian manuscript suggests these universal mystical principles were present in early Christianity too. Such teaching would have been deeply threatening to institutional religion. If people can access divine truth directly, what's the purpose of ecclesiastical authority? If spiritual awakening is available through personal experience rather than official doctrine, why do you need bishops to interpret Scripture? If divine revelation continues through individual consciousness rather than ending with canonical texts, how do religious institutions maintain control over spiritual truth? The manuscript contains another passage that addresses this tension directly. Jesus is recorded as warning his disciples that future religious leaders will claim exclusive authority over divine truth. They will insist that salvation comes only through their institutions. They will demand submission to their interpretations of spiritual reality. But Jesus tells his followers that such claims contradict the very nature of divine presence, which cannot be contained or controlled by human organizations. Whether these words actually came from Jesus matters less than what they reveal about early Christian communities that preserved them. These people understood that spiritual authority ultimately rests in direct experience rather than institutional position. They valued personal awakening over doctrinal conformity. They recognized that divine truth transcends any single religious system. This perspective explains why such texts were suppressed. Imperial Christianity needed unified doctrine to serve political purposes. Constantine required religious cohesion to hold his empire together. Bishops needed exclusive authority to maintain their positions. Alternative teachings that emphasized individual spiritual autonomy threatened the entire system. But suppression was never complete. The Ethiopian manuscript proves that communities existed beyond imperial reach who maintained these alternative perspectives. They copied texts generation after generation, preserving teachings that challenged institutional Christianity's foundational assumptions. For over 14 centuries, these voices waited in mountain monasteries, while Orthodox tradition claimed universal authority. This Ethiopian manuscript represents far more than an archaeological curiosity. It's a window into the spiritual revolution that early Christianity could have become. For 14 centuries, these teachings waited in silence, while institutional power shaped a very different narrative. Now they speak again, challenging us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about Jesus, his message, and the movement he inspired. The conversation about Christian origins will never be the same. And somewhere in those remote highland monasteries, more ancient voices are waiting to be heard.